Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here during this truly frantic time of the term. My name is Petra McGillen, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of German Studies, where I research and teach 19th century media history and journalistic practices on the spectrum between truth-telling and faking. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural lecture of our event series for this academic year, Data and its Discontents, a Year of Critical Information Studies. The series is part of a Dartmouth working group on fake news, propaganda, and narrative that my colleagues Lynn Paddock, Dan Rockmore, and I co-founded in 2021. Our aim is to bring into dialogue the multidisciplinary research that is happening in numerous areas of our campus on fake news and its relationship with storytelling as a social force and driver of social thought and action. Our intellectual home is the Susan and James WRIGHT Center for the Study of Computation and Just Communities, and I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the WRIGHT Center for the sustained support of our activities. As most of you know, President Emeritus James WRIGHT passed away last month. The center was established and named in his and Susan's honor in 2020, and their deep commitment to the creation of just communities and interdisciplinary scholarship has shaped not just the work of the center, but of Dartmouth as a whole. I'd also like to acknowledge Christine Monagle and David Merker for their invaluable help with setting up this and all of our events. I'm truly honored to introduce our speaker, Professor Elizabeth Losh. Liz Losh comes to us from the College of William and Mary, where she leads the Equality Lab and serves as the Duane A. and Virginia S. Dittman Professor of American Studies and English. Her broad and exciting research agenda focuses on how digital media and mobile technologies are transforming traditional institutions and public memory. She is the author of several books, including Virtualpolitik, an electronic history of government media making in a time of war, scandal, disaster, miscommunication, and mistake, which came out with MIT Press in 2009, and of The War on Learning, Gaining Ground in the Digital University, which was published by the same press in 2014. She also wrote the volume on hashtag in Bloomsbury's well-known Object Lessons series. Most recently, however, she has devoted her attention to an omnipresent but understudied actor in US American politics, the smartphone. You might find the thought a bit unusual that an everyday device should have political agency. But in light of recent media and political history, combined with current statistics about smartphone use, the thought becomes rather compelling. If you are anything like the average smartphone user in the US, you unlocked your phone 242 times today already, and you're going to unlock it another 110 times before you tuck in tonight. Indeed, there are few tools and media that we keep this close at all times. Glasses, perhaps, or dentures, or a pacemaker. Smartphones, then, are among the few media that are so deeply connected with our bodies, our habits, and our everyday lives that they have become inseparable from us. According to the media theorist Marshall McLuhan, media, and in particular those that we keep so close, are extensions of ourselves. The wheel is an extension of the foot, the lens an extension of the eye. In the same vein, the smartphone can be understood as an extension of mental agency and consciousness. It enables us, as Liz Losh puts it, to offload memories, navigation functions, and other conscious and unconscious aspects of mental life, and connects us with our bodies and our minds to distributed networks. Seen from this perspective, it becomes completely plausible that the smartphone and wireless technology in a more general sense has fundamentally changed the ways we do democracy. This afternoon, Liz Losh will tell us more about this change. In her brand new book, Selfie Democracy, The New Digital Politics of Disruption and Insurrection, which just came out with MIT Press, she argues that the shift toward wireless technologies had vast and unintended consequences for political leadership and re-scripted the modes of civic participation. Focusing on the presidencies of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, She shows how political leaders appeal to Silicon Valley-infused myths about the smartphone as a means of connection, transparency, and direct political access. In contrast to this rhetoric, however, digital technology actually fosters behaviors that can undermine representative forms of government. I'm very excited that Liz Losh will share key insights from her new book with us. The title of her talk is A More Perfect User: White House Rhetoric About Technology and Anxieties About Race, Gender, and Class. Please help me welcome Professor Liz Losh.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Let me make sure I'm all mic'd up. And thanks to everyone who's facilitated my visit and everyone being here at this crazy time in the quarter. I'm a rhetorician, and when I think about the topic of digital rhetoric, I'm not just talking about rhetoric about digital culture, but also about how platforms, algorithms, and interfaces can be thought of as vehicles for rhetorical expression as well. So my first book was about desktop computing in the White House, and I was interested in how digital files might reach unintended audiences and be used for unanticipated purposes. And in this new book, I'm in some ways going back to some of the questions in my first book, but this time I'm thinking about ubiquitous computing rather than desktop computing. The book draws on in-depth interviews with strategists, programmers, designers, and hacktivists. I was fortunate to be able to interview the head of digital strategy for both Obama's campaign and his first term in office. I interviewed the chief digital strategist for Hillary Clinton during her time in the State Department and in her second run for the presidency. And I also interviewed the man who taught Donald Trump how to tweet. In addition to that, I'm interested in using digital tools in order to ask new kinds of research questions, although I like to say that I'm interested in little data rather than big data. So for example, Donald Trump had over 50,000 tweets, but my chapter about Donald Trump on Twitter really focuses on those tweets that contain emojis. So looking at a set of sort of less than 1,000 tweets with those emojis and trying to think about the patterns that could be observed. So the book basically has two major theses. One is about disintermediation and how fantasies of direct democracy undermine representative government. So people often think about Obama and Trump as very different, but I'm trying to think about them together. I'm trying to think about the ways that they both rose to power as comparative political outsiders, the ways that they used social media and the smartphone in order to build a community of followers around them, and the ways that they also used Silicon Valley talking points about connection, access, participation, and transparency, how they benefited from certain kinds of insider deals with technology companies, and how consequently they hesitated to regulate those companies. And so things like Section 230 of the Communications Act are things that are still not really dealt with when it comes to regulating big tech. So that tends to be the sort of general talk that I often give about this book. But there's another thesis in the book that I'm going to be talking about in depth today, which is how ubiquitous computing exposes other kinds of anxieties about race, gender, and class. And so that's really going to be the story that I'm focusing on for purposes of my talk today. Now, in thinking about gender and, say, digital privacy, I think the failed campaign of Hillary Clinton and the email scandal that's often seen, people often say either Hillary Clinton lost because of her gender or they lost because of her technology use. And I'm interested in combining those two things together. How can we think about how her technology use was gendered? And I'm also interested in questions of masculinity and the ways that Barack Obama has sort of, in terms of crafting his political legacy, he was careful to distance himself from the service and information economy and that kind of feminized labor that might be associated with the kind of work being done by the person on the other side of this screen. But for purposes of this talk, I'm really going to be focusing very closely on questions of race and the ways that both Obama's post-racial vision of a technologically inclusive future and Trump's tendency to sort of demonize particular kinds of users, particularly Black women, can be thought of together. So when conservative pundits saw an image of Barack Obama posing for a selfie with two other heads of state at the funeral of former South African President Nelson Mandela, they pounced. Obama was often cast by such critics as pandering to the digital generation's exhibitionism, self-affirmation, and self-love. Right-wing commentators clucked over the signs of flawed character and criticized Obama for succumbing to the narcissistic distractions of the personal screen. Not surprisingly, Donald Trump retweeted a message of disapproval about his nemesis. Quote, "A real president wouldn't take a selfie during any memorial service. Hashtag Nelson Mandela Memorial." Researchers Nancy Baim and Kate Miltner analyzed news coverage of the Selfiegate incident to see how the story was framed. They claimed that the image was influential because it was, quote, "not actually a selfie, but a depiction of the act of taking a selfie, and thus polysemic in ways that evoke multiple simultaneous cultural shifts and anxieties," end quote. They argued that the picture, quote, "captures the increased popularity of selfie taking, raising questions about who takes selfies and under what circumstances, as well as the infusion of technological gadgets into events where they were previously absent," end quote. The image also speaks to the social fabric that led to a man of color being president and a woman being prime minister. In this way, the Mandela funeral selfie is an image representing representation. It operates through depictions of traditional politics, because heads of state both signify the body politic as sovereigns and craft their own media images, identity politics, because women and people of color are often excluded as marginalized groups and yet serve as signifiers of political transformation, and technology, because a media device documents a particular scene and is also present as an actor in the frame. Nicholas Mirzoff, a critic of visual culture, who's actually giving a talk on the Dartmouth campus at the same moment in time, also considered Obama's selfie to be worthy of interpretation because it encapsulated how an image could serve as, quote, "the interface between the way we think we look and the way others see us." Thus, the photo was both an image of seeing and an image of being seen. For him, this kind of selfie conflated machine image and digital performance. Critics of visual culture, like Mirzoff, assert that powerful images often give implicit instructions to viewers about what and how to see. According to this school of thought, pictures are not passive objects to be interpreted by a neutral observer. They are the active agents of indoctrination by visual culture. For example, the famous 3D glasses image of Obama vividly places visual culture on display. The photograph shows each person in the audience looking through their own individual lenses while sharing a moment of communal spectatorship. Unlike most Obama photos, none of the gazes connect people together in the frame. And yet there's a certain egalitarianism in the assembly. Obama is the focus, but he is part of a collective experience in which media entertain and inform a group. The caption notifies the viewer that they are giving their rapt attention to an innovative Super Bowl commercial with 3D visual effects. The photographer is also performing an homage to other iconic photographs of spectators in 3D movie theaters, including Ouija's 1945 In the Palace Theater and J.R. Ironman's classic photos shot for Life magazine in 1952. The philosopher of science, Bruno Latour, asserted that political representation and visual representation are closely related. In bringing together the, quote, two different meanings of the word representation that have been kept separate in theory, end quote, Latour hopes to correct, quote, a bias in much of political philosophy, end quote, that ignores the fundamental connection between representative government and artistic and scientific representation. The Obama selfie-taking image is a particular kind of representation of popular sovereignty and the body politic. 3 heads of state from 3 different forms of representative democracy are engaged in a lighthearted exchange during the somber ceremony of a state funeral. We see these government leaders in a moment of self-representation and media making together. Depending on one's attitude, this incident might seem to either undermine the trio's executive authorities as rulers or humanize them as digital citizens sharing common practices with their constituents. Unlike photographs shot by journalists from news organizations such as the Johannesburg selfie-taking picture, state-sanctioned images like this one do much more than merely show the embodiment of power. They also communicate messages in a visual language about how the symbolic order of political sovereignty functions. Such images often show a leader's bodily relationship to a complex assemblage of objects, including devices that sense, record, store, transmit, network, calculate, aggregate, select, and display information. Historically, official portrait paintings have showcased rulers' masteries of other kinds of information technologies. Therefore, it's not surprising to see that the tools of computational media are often featured in the Obama iconography of digital culture. The highly curated and constrained photo collection in the official White House archive also promoted a vision of a shared American technological imagination that is also fundamentally depicted as post-racial. Technology is shown as a means to unite the nation rather than divide it. From tablet touchscreen computing to 3D motion capture, the president modeled when and how to be a cyborg in contemporary culture. In the visual record vetted by the White House, Obama appeared as a fluent technology user. He was shown as someone who could also resist the incursions of technology and maintain independence from its manipulation and distraction. Images of human-computer interaction like those on the official White House website gave the viewer lessons in how to be an ideal user of new media technologies and how the central political, cultural, and social space in the country could be occupied physically and virtually in the era of ubiquitous computing. They also put forward implicit arguments about race, gender, class, and ability in presenting particular kinds of technology users. Oops. One famous pre-White House photograph of Obama shows the president-elect pointing directly at the camera as he sits behind a Pac-Man stickered Mac laptop surrounded by a number of handheld devices and peripherals. It's an image of the incoming chief executive as a multitasker. After all, Obama was the first social media president, the first to regularly carry a mobile wireless device on his person, and the first to emphasize the integration of computation in a campaign. After he assumed office, however, the main message from White House social media seemed to be that the first digital president should be a detached subject of computer-mediated messages and no longer an intimately connected producer-receiver of them. Although the smartphone often appeared in media coverage on the campaign trail, the White House official Flickr photo stream rarely showed President Obama on his famous BlackBerry during his first years in office. And I should point out that these 4 images are selected from thousands of images that don't show the BlackBerry. So it's sort of interesting to see that these are the cases where you can actually sort of see Obama using his BlackBerry. When images did capture him using his most common type of mobile technology, it was generally outside the Oval Office and far from the official spaces of statecraft. The photo stream emphasized a visual rhetoric of Obama checking BlackBerry messages offstage, outdoors, behind his shoes, on the other side of a barrier, or in the dead of night. It is also possible to examine how non-human agents might shape or misshape the public record of our democratic institutions. As the Obama years progressed, the power to select and organize digital content was increasingly wielded by non-humans through machine learning, computer vision, biometrics, and autonomous sensing. One moment in 2014 marked how much this shift to data valence had been normalized. As President Barack Obama sat facing a large oil painting of a pensive Abraham Lincoln, the 44th president was separated from the 16th by an elaborate cage of digital capture and illumination elements. The apparatus was composed of 50 custom-built LED modules, 8 high-resolution sports photography devices, and 6 additional wide-angle cameras, all designed to simulate 10 different lighting conditions in the space of a mere second. The president froze in position as bursts of light danced across his face. He maintained an impassive demeanor as members of the data gathering team circled him with handheld scanners. Obama was posing for a 3D portrait commissioned by the Smithsonian Institution, which was to be digitally rendered in color and printed also as a monochromatic bust. The enthusiasm of the first Black president for this type of scanning project might be perplexing, given the troubling legacies of scientific racism, anthropometry, phrenology, and physiognomy in the history of human classification and political surveillance. In recent years, Black scholars have emphasized how such software tends to privilege whiteness, and how this predisposition perpetuates biased measurement systems resembling those developed through slavery and colonialism. The prejudices of supposedly neutral systems are most obviously revealed when computer vision misrecognizes Black faces. In 2015, Google was forced to apologize after Black users of its image recognition photo app discovered that the system labeled them as gorillas rather than as human beings. In 2018, Amazon's face recognition system falsely matched 28 members of Congress with mugshots, disproportionately doing so to legislators who were people of color. Such systems are often trained on data sets of white faces, and the Silicon Valley assumptions that set white as the default condition are often reinforced in the programming and testing processes as well. Many Black thinkers link these modern biometric technologies to the long history of personal identification methods used to secure captive labor. Simone Brown connects the fact that airport scanning machines were likely to have difficulty with Black hair to older mechanisms that policed Black bodies, such as 18th century lantern laws. Jessica Marie Johnson has observed that the systematic datafication of bodies through markup practices continued the death work of the slave ship register. Ruha Benjamin has analyzed the larger socio-technical apparatus of digital control of Black bodies that includes dash cams in police cars and ankle monitoring devices. And I'd point also to the work of Rupika Rassam and the work of Jackie Wernemont in sort of thinking through this relationship between data, slavery, and colonialism. While the Smithsonian Institution was capturing Obama's biometric data, the racial implications seem to be far from the minds of those present. Tom Khalil of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy enthused about a third digital revolution finally coming to fruition, and with it, the combination of the digital world and the physical world. The portable light stage transported to the state dining room was managed by the Institute for Creative Technologies, an academic research institute known for creating high-tech war games and military training simulations, as well as dazzling special effects for action movies. All of these components in the spectacle, biometrics, machine sensing, simulation, and 3D fabrication, were important topics in the technological imagination of the Obama administration. They were also part of a narrative about the role of race in a post-human future, which promised to be a post-racial future as well. Biometric data gathering within the federal government intensified with the Obama White House's aspirations to run the first fully digital administration. For example, the Office of Management and Budget explored schemes for authenticating documents with new kinds of electronic signatures. Experts explored confirming identity with a biometric supplement to these signatures, such as fingerprints, retinal patterns, and voice recognitions. Visitors to biometric.gov could read about biometrics in government post 9/11, the Identity Management Task Force, and the National Biometrics Challenge. The latter envisioned a partnership between government, industry, and academia to promote the interoperability and consistency of recognition programs that would allow computers to categorize individual people while also maintaining privacy protections and safeguards on personal data. Once gathered, these enormous quantities of data could be filtered, correlated, and sorted by machine vision algorithms. These algorithms were designed to police national security, public safety, intellectual property, civic propriety, medical normality, and gender conformity. The administration celebrated companies that used these technologies for their ingenuity and economic promise. For example, Kairos, a Black-founded facial recognition firm, was chosen for the 2015 White House Demo Day. Kairos advertised a range of services that included age and gender detection with its easy-to-code API. This is an example of a pitch from Kairos. Kairos wasn't the only computer vision company invited to Demo Day. At the part pick booth, 2 Black representatives showed Obama how to use his smartphone camera to find a matching replacement part. Of course, the big players in the machine vision industry were not startups like Kairos or PartPick, which were run by Black entrepreneurs. They were established companies like Apple and Amazon with white tech evangelist figureheads. In fact, just a year after she appeared at Demo Day, PartPick co-founder Jewel Burks sold the company to Amazon. Despite its potential risk, computer vision was very appealing to administration officials as a way to promote safety and efficiency. It was seen as cheaper, easier, and a more reliable alternative to human oversight. In contexts where careful scrutiny by federal officers was no longer practical, such as at the nation's borders, computers could take over from beleaguered human beings. Obama associated himself and his presidency with machine vision by publicizing digital activities in which seeing was performed by computer technologies. For example, in 2013, he visited the DreamWorks animation studios. While actors in tight-fitting black suits covered with green targets pranced and gesticulated in front of the president, director Dean DeBlois explained the basic principles of how motion capture worked to create real-time special effects. Obama even held the virtual camera himself. Near the end of his presidency, in an interview with Wired magazine, Obama described how machines can make a bunch of quick decisions much faster and more wisely than mere humans, and thereby begin to tackle difficult problems with traffic fatalities, gridlock, and emissions. At the same time, he acknowledged that human values must be embedded in such high-tech machines. He referred obliquely to the famous trolley problem, a thought experiment in philosophy in which a runaway vehicle could either kill one person on one trajectory or multiple people on another, depending upon the flip of a switch. According to Obama, the behavior of an autonomous vehicle might be similarly governed by a moral decision, quote, not just a pure utilitarian decision, end quote. In 2010, Obama was happy to be photographed with HRP-4C in Yokohama, Japan. This lifelike female robot, nicknamed Meme, had a silicone head and an armor-like metallic torso. Among other stunts, she could sing Japanese pop songs. On news accounts described Meme flexing her muscles before the American president, but the actual video of her meeting shows a much more subservient encounter. Obama smiles, but he does not deign to address her. Quote, "This exhibition shows Japan's strengths and attraction," she says to him. "Please see, touch, and feel Japan's advanced technology," end quote. Despite the invitation, Obama does not touch Meme. The way that technology is gendered and raced in the scene with Meme goes without comment. It's interesting that Obama interacted exclusively with robots who were either Asian, white, or raceless, rather than Black like himself, despite the fact that Black robots played a significant role in the American cultural imagination. In the 1930s, the Westinghouse Electric Corporation exhibited Rastus Robot, who was billed as a mechanical Negro. He could bow, say a few words, and sit obediently with an apple on his head while an arrow was aimed at it. According to Simone Brown, Rastus may have been created, quote, to soothe concerns around robots replacing human workers, because unlike Westinghouse's other robots of the time, this robot was a symbol of black servitude, end quote. Brown argues that Rastus was intended to comfort white members of the working class by reminding them of their racial superiority. Like other technology companies praised on the White House website, Westinghouse was frequently lauded as an exemplary corporation. No mention was made of their earlier racist ventures in robotics. Instead of presenting robots merely as labor-saving devices, the Obama communications team presented them as symbols of human connection and empathy. Robots could also dramatize the reciprocal ties between a political leader and his constituents. For example, in 2015, the president was shown in the White House conversing via a telepresence robot with Alice Wong, a disabled activist based in San Francisco. Wong had a neuromuscular disorder and had lost her ability to walk as a child. Her telepresence robot allowed her, as a person with a disability, to stand facing the president. The most advanced telepresence robots could actually be controlled by a person's brain signals, so the device could navigate a room. Official photographer Pete Susek published a photo on his Instagram feed that depicts an intimate eye-level exchange between Obama and Wong. Another photo shows Wong's robot being ushered out of the room by one of the social aides, this is the picture here, managing the reception line so the president could meet with the next visitor with a disability. Obama's encounters with robots were often part of a narrative about the education of young people in STEM fields. For example, the White House screening of Underwater Dreams publicized the story of young, undocumented Mexican immigrants assembling Stinky, an underwater robot from Home Depot parts, and triumphing over a team of more privileged students from MIT. Robonaut, that's Robonaut here, NASA's own fist-bumping robot, also appeared at the event and shook the hand of a young black girl. In a curated collection of photos on the White House website titled President Obama and Robots, Our 5 Favorite Moments, 3 of the 5 photos show high school students showing off their robots to the president. Obama's interactions with robots were depicted by conservatives as alarming. During a visit to Japan in April of 2014, Obama played soccer with the famed Honda robot Asimo, and also courted controversy by showing deference to the foreign non-human. The, quote, US president bows to Japanese robot, the Drudge Report screamed. The headline in the New York Post also emphasized Obama's subservience, quote, Obama bows to robot in Japan, finds it scary, end quote. Such anti-Obama tech stories became a staple of right-wing news. They were often consumed by those who identified as older and white. Some were people displaced from jobs in manufacturing by the acceleration of the revolution in robotics. The term post-human describes many of Obama's performances with technology. The White House promoted enthusiastic engagement with artificial intelligence, computer vision, simulation, and robotics. In her 1996 book, How We Became Post-Human, Catherine Hales traces the development of 3 stories: how information lost its body, how the cyborg was created as a technological artifact and cultural icon, and how a historically specific construction called the human is giving way to a different construction called the post-human. For Hales, the dream of science fiction to transcend the body might actually be a nightmare. The Obama administration celebrated all 3 of these narratives. Big data was no longer confined to a single container and could be repurposed and reconfigured easily. Robots were the proof that a more just, empathetic, and advanced society was possible, and technology demanded that humans rapidly evolve for their own betterment. The post-human future presented by the White House was in many ways also a post-racial one. It celebrated the coming of a colorblind, high-tech utopia in which Black entrepreneurs, Mexican immigrants, and Asian activists had equal opportunities for success. This was a future in which fist-bumping would no longer signify membership in a particular racial subculture. Instead, the fist bump would become a universal symbol for affirmation for the human and non-human alike. It was a vision of progress that for Obama was informed by the optimistic science fiction TV shows of his youth, like Star Trek, which posit a colorblind world in which a cast of multi-ethnic and multi-species characters could solve problems collectively. In contrast to this post-racial vision of a technological future, media scholar Beth Coleman has pointed to the ways that race itself serves as a kind of technology that may have the power to liberate as well as to oppress. According to Coleman, race operates as a levered mechanism that creates movement and diversifies articulation. Rather than being a trap, it can function as a trapdoor. Coleman argues that Obama mastered technologies for operationalizing his blackness. Perhaps Obama also attempted to hack the existing racial repertoire with its own code by playing off assumptions about racial difference. In 2014, Obama was celebrated as the first US president to write a line of code and dubbed coder-in-chief in White House press releases. This allowed him to adopt the position of a particular kind of cultural hero, the hacker. Optimistic visions of hacking already abounded in White House rhetoric. Hackers were even presented as potential savior through civic hacking and hacking for humanity. At the event where he earned his honorary title, Obama participated in an hour of code with New Jersey middle school students learning JavaScript. He wore a baseball cap from Code.org, a self-directed online curriculum funded by Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and other Silicon Valley titans. The coding exercise used material from the Disney movie Frozen. During the exchange, the president joked that he was an old man and encouraged the young people present to make their own games. He also briefly lectured the students about zeros and ones that could be translated into electrical messages. In saying this, Obama had actually mischaracterized the difference between a programming language and computer processing instructions in binary code. Other adults in the room quickly stepped in to clarify the president's explanation. Adriana Mitchell, the young black woman patiently instructing the president about composing lines of code, did not fit right-wing stereotypes about black female technology users that I will discuss in a moment. She was not a freeloader, schemer, or a damsel in distress. She was a programmer. However, digital literacy specialists have questioned the Obama administration's emphasis on coding as a direct and unambiguous path of escape from racism, sexism, and poverty. Digital literacy scholar Annette V has examined how the moralism and class snobbery of 19th and 20th century literacy campaigns persist in 21st century computer programming education. Media scholar S. Craig Watson has chronicled the shortcomings of a game design class serving black and brown students in a year-long study of a low-income Texas high school that turned out to be technology-rich but curriculum poor. Miriam Posner has ridiculed the urge to exhort everyone to code without considering why the tech sector lacks diversity. Computer historian Janet Abate has looked at what she calls the pipeline argument, which, quote, blames women and minorities themselves for not preparing sufficiently and reinforces stereotypes about the kinds of people who succeed in tech, equating the masculine pattern of early obsessive interest in computers with talent and commitment. All of these critics question the misplaced enthusiasm of politicians and educators for privileging computer programming over other kinds of competencies that are also needed for success. According to this line of thinking, treating coding as a meritocratic skill that serves both the ends and the means of social justice displaces the importance of systemic change. So I'm going to quickly skip over healthcare.gov, but I can talk about that a little bit in the Q&A. And I want to go ahead and sort of fast forward to Donald Trump. Certainly, computer programmers have become diminished as cultural heroes in recent years. The rise of technologies that use machine learning and computerized sensing have destabilized long-held assumptions about human mastery and personal agency. Although the writing, reading, and sharing of code will continue to be an important form of literacy for many years, a literacy that still enables some elite forms of access to and participation in an increasingly technologically mediated and embedded world, computer programming knowledge isn't always adequate for decoding the increasingly complex relationships in contemporary life. Obama-era technocrats championed artificial intelligence as a way to enable faster, fair, and better decision-making. They also promoted accelerating the robotic revolution that would transfer menial, dangerous, or cumbersome labor to autonomous agents. Shifting away from human brains and brawn as the basis of political sovereignty to a more post-human philosophy of government was a risky strategy. As president, Donald Trump would not be writing computer code or shaking hands with robots. He would reverse the White House's confidence in simulation, artificial intelligence, machine vision, and other advanced computing technologies. So then I'm going to go back in time now to October 17, 2012. Long before he became a presidential candidate, Donald J. Trump posted a message on Twitter with a now familiar tone. Great, now Supreme Court justices are talking about a constitutional right to a cell phone. Obama, just stop already. Unlike Trump's far more prolific tweets from this period calling for the release of Obama's birth certificate, this tweet about whether US citizens were legally entitled to wireless digital communication was relatively obscure even to his followers. Only a few hundred people engaged with the post. Several political liberals pointed to the inaccuracies of Trump's message. The concept of a constitutional right to a cell phone came from retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, not from the White House or from current members of the court. At an event hosted by a nonprofit organization lobbying for tougher gun control, the former justice had been asked about the doctrine of self-defense as justification for the right to bear arms. In response, Stevens suggested that, quote, maybe you have some kind of constitutional right to have a cell phone with a pre-dialed 911 number at your bedside, and that might provide you with better protection than a gun. Trump's tweet might seem to be a complaint about government overreach, but if liberals saw Trump's reference to Obama as a non sequitur, conservatives immediately understood the unspoken premise that tied the cell phone story to the 44th president. During the 2012 presidential campaign, which was in its final days when Trump tweeted his message, the myth that the government was handing out free smartphones with cellular service had become a powerful narrative for focusing right-wing outrage. Supposedly, this cell phone distribution program was intended to secure the loyalties of minority inner-city voters. These so-called Obama phones became the perfect myth to tie the country's first black president and his Silicon Valley rhetoric to an unequal plan for doling out the nation's technological resources. One racially charged story on the Drudge Report had gone viral just a few weeks before. It featured a black woman praising the Obama phone program. Conservative pundits seized on the Obama phone lady. Rush Limbaugh reduced her to an object of scorn. She may not know who George Washington is or to Abraham Lincoln, but she knows how to get an Obama phone. Conspiracy theorist Alex Jones invited her onto InfoWars, where the two agreed about the dangers of government surveillance. Soon she became a kind of internet celebrity, like other kooky viral stars enjoying a dubious moment of fame. There were video remixes and ringtones. The original video racked up over 9 million views. It was a meme that many Obama haters would have known without any direct reference. The week of Trump's tweet, the clip of the woman praising Obama phones appeared in an anti-Obama attack ad for Republican challenger Mitt Romney. Although the advertisement was ostensibly produced by a Political Action Committee, or PAC, called the Tea Party Victory Fund, the spot appears to have had financial and strategic ties to the party establishment. Hidden beneath the avalanche of Obama phone memes was a fragment of truth. A federal program called Lifeline, established in 1985, had been providing universal access to telephone services. The modest program didn't cover expensive calling services or long-distance charges, but it offered a basic utility at a low cost. The simple proposition that people with low income should have access to basic services and information was reframed as a giveaway to people of color who didn't deserve such a sophisticated device. In fact, the smartphone could connect the disadvantaged to the internet in a much more cost-effective way that was more practical than relying on home computer ownership or broadband service. Yet, like the food stamps program that provided grocery assistance to the poor, conservatives viewed this universal service as wasteful spending that was ripe for fraud and abuse. Many local news programs aired stories showing undercover reporters acquiring free cell phones without providing any proof of financial hardship, some collecting multiple devices. A Denver broadcast described phones being handed out like Halloween candy. The Tulsa program showed a man with 2 duffel bags full of mobile devices. In Baltimore, newscasters claimed drug dealers were benefiting from the plethora of cell phones flooding the streets. The subtext for these depictions of scams and double dealing was reflexive moral outrage about government handouts. Critics referred to the program as phone stamps. Trump's 2012 tweet mocking a right to own a cell phone focused on a specific kind of right, one assumed to be founded in natural law, self-preservation, and a might makes right understanding of the world consistent with Trump's general moral philosophy. Extending an ethical claim for a right to ownership to members of an underclass offended his sensibilities, particularly when the tool was judged a luxury. In the spirit of Justice Stevens' thought experiment, it might be useful to consider all the rights that a system of mobile communications, telecommunications subsidies might affirm. Rather than seeing the smartphone simply as an aid for protecting bodily integrity, experts in human-computer interaction tend to view it as an extension of mental agency and consciousness. Former President Barack Obama was associated with a broad range of digital practices during his time in the White House, from shooting selfies to directing drones. In contrast, the presidency of Donald Trump was largely affiliated with a behavior normalized by a single technology company, Twitter. But the digital literacy of both presidents involved a complex repertoire of technologies, platforms, devices, and advisors. Access to compact and unobtrusive mobile computing is certainly transforming politics and civic discourse at all levels. We need to examine the unintended consequences of this transition to a new way of doing democracy, a change that has taken place with remarkably little comment or critical reflection. Part of this absence of informed commentary has to do with the fact that technologists and humanists are often siloed, although there's an energetic cohort of researchers studying the legal, ethical, cultural, and political consequences of pervasive computing technologies, some of whom are here at Dartmouth. Although this is largely an argument about digital media, reality television also shaped Trump's public personality. Television scholars have argued that reality-oriented programming has been a driving force in the entire media ecosystem for many decades, and it's designed to fulfill the audience's desires to see people's private lives and unfiltered emotions, and to cut production costs by jettisoning professionals. Its supposedly unscripted storylines depend on highly formulaic genres, characters, tropes, and catchphrases. It also promotes specific political narratives, particularly those that feature drama about gender, sexuality, race, and class. A 2015 episode of Who Stole My Phone on Trump's Celebrity Apprentice caricatures Black women and their cell phone use and furthers a right-wing narrative about technology and identity politics. After contestant Vivica A. Fox discovers that her smartphone is missing, the actor suddenly finds herself at a disadvantage because she is unable to Google information needed by her team to complete tasks. She is also bereft of her lists of contacts and virtual and personal information. The loss of the phone requires that Fox perform a strange minstrel act for the camera. At one point, she laments in Black dialect that she feels like, quote, like I done lost my child with my phone gone, end quote. She's subsequently told that she posted an uncharacteristic update on Twitter during the phone's absence, quote, this menopause, it's killing me, I can't think straight, I'm acting a damn fool half the time. 50 just isn't sexy. Fox immediately blames the other Black women remaining on the show for the sabotage. Speaking as the accused, Kenya Moore from the Real Housewives of Atlanta appeals to Trump to serve as Solomon and decide which woman is telling the truth. Donald Trump Sr. utters very few words in the episode as he expresses disgust during the pair's confrontation and calls Moore nasty, a term he famously also used against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. For Trump fans, the show plays on stereotypes about Black women as irresponsible users of technology, and it furthers earlier racist and sexist stereotypes about the Obama phone that linked digital literacy in identity politics. In Who Stole My Phone, two Black women squabble over access to a digital device and are taught a lesson about digital literacy and the perils of their public visibility. Like Obama's mediagenic web content, Trump's TV episodes were didactic in promoting a politics of normative digital consumption. And now we move forward to the period just before the January 6th insurrection. Two Black women weren't mentioned explicitly in Trump's speech on January 6th, but they had been called out earlier in a speech by Rudy Giuliani the month before. These women were also featured in Trump's pressure tactic phone calls to Georgia's Secretary of State. Election workers Ruby Freeman and her daughter Shay Moss were accused of manipulating systems for scanning ballots. Giuliani also denounced them for passing a mysterious object, which is suspected of being a digital storage device. Quote, like they were vials of heroin or cocaine. Giuliani was drawing upon stories from the right-wing news site Gateway Pundit, which claimed a video showing Ruby secretly passing something to her daughter during the ballot counting, which they speculated was a USB stick. They reiterated the allegation in another story about seeing, quote, the mother and daughter pass an object the size of a thumb drive between each other in a suspicious manner. Although Moss asserted that the object was a ginger mint, the depiction of high-tech skullduggery stuck, and the women were subjected to months of harassment. The notion that Black women were self-interested technology users willing to subvert the voting process had benefited from a decade of internet folklore about ubiquitous computing being abused by people of color, which dated back to the Obama phone lady. In examining Trump's attempt to link anxieties about new digital technologies to old racial hostilities, we can also see how the promise of pervasive, mobile, personalized, and intelligent technologies revealed the nightmare of digital populism they could unleash. What Trump's followers got instead of direct democracy was selfie democracy. Selfie democracy combines three key elements to make its heady cocktail of political extremism: ubiquitous computing, identity politics, and hostility to representative government. It presents a fantasy of disintermediation that links a political subject directly to his or her sovereign through an experience of digital co-presence. A leader can be hailed by a citizen on social media using a more intimate second-person address than would normally be possible. When that leader shows up in that person's social media feed, sharing similar thoughts and feelings, that citizen might imagine being spoken to personally, even if their actual queries are going unanswered. Trump's followers attempted to use their smartphones to reinscribe a human presence in an increasingly post-human world. They were responding to a real situation of becoming increasingly disempowered by the prevalence of digital systems that demanded total subservience to the mechanisms of surveillance and decision engineering. But understandable feelings of being constrained by new technologies and by plutocrats and their proprietary algorithms can also be channeled into conspiracy theories about 5G networks and thermostats for smart homes. We need to understand the pitfalls of the new digital politics in more complex ways and acknowledge the powerful appeals of nostalgia for a direct democracy that never was. We need to interrogate our deep social and psychological desires for connection, transparency, access, and participation, and we need to understand the role of class, race, and gender in the assumptions that we make about supposedly neutral platforms. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this truly thought-provoking talk, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. I'd like to remind everyone to please speak into one of the two microphones if possible to ask your question, because we are live streaming this event, and otherwise people cannot hear your questions. Or maybe, Liz, you could also repeat a question in case someone doesn't make it to a microphone.
Okay, great.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you.
Sure, absolutely. I think I see a question from Jacqueline Wernemont. I will let her go up to the microphone.
Sorry, everybody. Tried to attack myself there. Thanks, Liz, for that great talk. You didn't get a chance to talk about healthcare.gov, and I don't want to ask you about that, but another healthcare initiative during the Obama presidency, because I think I hear a connection, and that's the precision medicine effort, right, that was launched by the Obama White House and continues, right? So that effort, for those who don't know, was designed to bring as much data as possible to emerging healthcare practices. The idea was that people would volunteer their data with the US government, for the benefit of all. And the idea was that people would be able to tackle more complicated, rare diseases, et cetera. So it strikes me that one of the things about the Precision Medicine Initiative is that it promises highly personalized healthcare. And it feels to me like there's something connected to this idea of direct democracy and the idea for personal connection that is also sort of there in the Obama administration's desire to gather as much big data as possible to fix the US healthcare system. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, and certainly this sort of shift toward personalized technologies was an important one that characterized the Obama administration. Within weeks of taking office, the administration reversed the White House cookie policy, which traditionally the White House had barred visitors to government websites, had barred data gathering on visitors to government websites. And that decision was supposedly to be in the user's best interest. But that move toward data gathering, just in the very first days in office, was one that eventually started to alarm people who were concerned about privacy issues. And I think this, certainly this big data approach, many people started to push back against the rise of big data policing and the kind of gathering of personal medical information, as you point out. And this combination of kind of, it'll just be data, writ large in very aggregated form, so we don't need to worry about it. Or it will be for your own good because it will provide these things that are so intensely personalized and targeted to you. That fundamental contradiction was not one that the administration was good in responding to. And I think they actually did a very poor job addressing a lot of the concerns about privacy that were being sort of raised as concerns in the conservative media ecosystem. So, the rollout of healthcare.gov was a disaster, but there was another disastrous web rollout that the Obama administration was involved in, and that was cars.gov. And there was similarly a right-wing backlash about privacy concerns and data collection connected to the cars.gov website. And again, the administration was sort of tone deaf when it came to these legitimate concerns about all of this data gathering that the government was engaged in. So I think that there's definitely a sort of philosophical orientation that was internally contradictory and also was often tone deaf to the concerns about privacy from the broader electorate. Yeah.
Is this one on? Yeah. Hi, Liz. Thanks so much for that. How do you think about concerns about the public, or at least, well, I guess the public generally has about government collection of data versus the complete not caring about the collection of
Yeah.
data by companies. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, it kind of astonishes me all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there is this sort of fear of the government world state and this sort of hegemonic figure of surveillance. But the problem is that we're all participating in these surveillance regimes every day that involve third parties. And so this sort of marketplace of private data that's being unregulated by the government. So for me, the issue isn't so much that we have this big brother who's surveilling us all that's facilitated by the government, but rather we have the lack of regulation around all these little brothers who are gathering data, and then that data can then be aggregated using third parties. So, and I think that it's interesting to look at other places in the world that have been more willing to regulate these companies. And I do think, and this is a point I often make, we're a deeply politically polarized country. And yet people on the right and people on the left agree that big tech companies are gathering too much private data about people. That's one thing that we should be able to agree on. There should be legislative action on, and yet it seems somehow our legislative branch is completely polarized when it comes to taking any action.
Just one follow-up, though. I mean, when we say people agree, people whose voices we hear on the left and on the right agree. And I often wonder if that's also how, I don't know, it's 1% on either side, to be generous, and there's 98% of the people who aren't heard at all about this. And I often wonder about the difference between, this country grew out of the fundamental distrust of government, whereas in other countries which have different data policies, they just have different origin stories. And so so for what it's, I often think about that we're more willing to trust the private sector than the public sector, and that around the world, that is, well, not often, but at least it's sometimes flipped.
Yeah, I lived in Estonia for last year on a Fulbright. We're doing research for my next book. And it's interesting to live in a society where people trust technology and trust the government much more than we do in this society. And it's interesting to see how the mistrust of digital voting technologies, if you remember back to Ed Felton and the demos during the Bush administration, there were actually people on the left who were really worried about voting technologies too. But I think it's interesting that this is something that like Josh Hawley and Bernie Sanders agree on, right? And despite what people sometimes call the privacy paradox, which is that people say they're concerned about privacy, but they give it up every day, every hour, every minute. That despite this sort of privacy paradox, I think that there is, the polling data show that there's a lot of support for better privacy regulation in the United States. And so it would be interesting to see some progress on that front, if possible. My guess is that it might come from the Supreme Court first, although they're not very strong on privacy, much stronger on liberty as a potential issue. Other questions?
So this is a very open-ended question. Just right at one of many things you said during this talk that piqued my curiosity was when you talked about the man who taught Trump to tweet. So yes. I wonder if you could just give us a little bit more of that backstory.
Yeah, so that's an amazing story. And one that surprisingly, media organizations have interviewed him a couple of times. His name is Peter Costanzo, and he was working as a book publicist at the time that he met Trump, and he was sort of helping Trump use social media to promote his books, sort of the initial function of Costanzo. But so he had 7 minutes on Donald Trump's calendar. So not 5 minutes, not 10 minutes, 7 minutes to explain what social media was to Donald Trump and show him how to use it. And the meeting ended up going longer than 7 minutes. But part of why Trump was interested in social media is there was a Trump imposter out there. That's part of the reason why it's real Donald Trump on Twitter, or was, before he was kicked off Twitter, is because there was this other imposter out there. And sometimes it's described as a satirical account, but if you look at the actual tweets, they're actually they seem to be done by someone who's a fan of the Apprentice franchise and seems to be wanting to sort of emulate Trump rather than make fun of him. So Trump wanted to get on social media in order to have this imposter be disempowered. And Costanzo contacted Facebook and said, can you hand over this fake account to the real Donald Trump? And Facebook said, okay, and handed over hundreds of thousands of followers. And those people were never told that they were following an imposter, right? And so the fact that Facebook, and at the time, if you remember, celebrities were just starting to vie for getting 1 million followers. So having a couple 100,000 followers was actually a lot of followers at the time. Twitter was like, no, you're going to have to actually earn your followers. And so it's interesting to see how Donald Trump then had to really learn from the people who were following his account kind of what Twitter was and how to use it. So it's an interesting digital literacy story for me. I mean, I think that we spend too much time just studying the digital literacy of 7-year-olds. I think studying the digital literacy of, senior citizen politicians is, for me, super interesting. So.
Yeah. Actually, can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Okay. What you're saying made me think of another question I had, which was that, you spoke about the sort of intimacy of this relationship with political figures and this sort of idea of selfie democracy. And so, I'm thinking, of course, of the famous anecdote around the arrival of television and the sort of Nixon-Kennedy debates, and this idea that when we suddenly have this intimacy, the kind of, awkward politician that is Nixon is sort of disfavored. But then we have this figure of Trump, who is both a television personality and a social media personality, sort of grotesque in like a sort of exaggerated way. So I just wonder if you could speak a little more about the nature of this intimacy, maybe in comparison with television, or however you think of it. But
so it's interesting to see how Trump would sort of assert a certain kind of executive personality and would claim in the beginning of his Twitter life. So in the beginning of his Twitter life, actually his tweets were mostly written by other people. But he would claim that he would dictate his tweets to an assistant, which is not true. He never did that. The tweets were either written by someone else and approved by him, or written collaboratively by his communication team. Or it's funny, his second social media handler, the person after Costanzo, when Trump got a new Android phone and figured out how to tweet by himself, the guy Justin McConney, who later went on to manage the social media of the band Aerosmith, when he saw that Trump could tweet by himself, he said it was like the moment in Jurassic Park where the scientists figured out that the dinosaurs could open doors, and he thought, oh no. So I mean, I do think that there's this. So back to the kind of question of, so he sort of maintains this sort of formality about his social media presence, this idea that he's sort of too busy for social media, like that social media is a little too personal. And yet when you look at his actual behavior, particularly once he learned how to tweet and retweet, you see these very intimate exchanges, particularly flirtation with women. I mean, if you look at the emoji tweets, it's an interesting subset to see sort of how he's retweeting these women's tweets, and sort of they're flirting with him, he's flirting back, and there's this sort of suggestion of kind of romantic or pararomantic overtures. So there are ways that this sort of social media intimacy which is something that he purports to kind of steer clear of, is something that he becomes very adept at. And I think that people have this tendency to look at the tweets that most easily become news headlines or sound bites, which Trump was very skilled at producing, but there are 50,000 tweets, right? There are a lot of other kinds of tweets in there. And there are a lot of just one-word tweets to followers that are just essentially phatic communication, just sort of channel checking, kind of just simple affirmations that just let people feel seen.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's good for accessibility.
So thanks for the great talk, Liz. I want to, your talk was mostly structured around juxtaposition, right, between Trump and Obama. And I'm really interested more in what your book is about, where you're pointing out the commonalities. And one thing that struck me in the themes that you listed was the commonalities, it seems to me, to sort of shout populism, right? That there were these Trump-Obama voters, or Obama-Trump voters who voted for both, and it seems that they have had this populist platform and populist manner in general. So I wanted to ask you about that in connection with your specific themes of transparency and direct access and that kind of thing. And then in conjunction with that and what we were just talking about, I'm curious about the question of charisma. Because as we were talking about at lunch, yes, digital technologies are disembodied. But these were embodied leaders, very embodied leaders. And their personal charisma definitely I came across in social media, but that was not all. Right, they had these rallies and public presentations, and many people have said that once Obama got out on the campaign trail before the midterms, he was the closer. And it was great to have such a talented politician, rhetorician back on stage. So is there digital charisma?
Absolutely.
Right.
I think so.
Okay.
And I think it's this, communicating this affective co-presence, this sense that even if you aren't physically co-present, that you still exist in the same social media bubble of friendship through a kind of imagined community around that sort of shared identity. It's really interesting to see the ways that, a lot of people forget this, but Obama had this social media platform, myBarackObama.com, where people who were, say, air traffic controllers or tango dancers or single mothers, these are all three real examples, could sort of find each other on this social media platform as supporters of Barack Obama. And when you think about the time period, right, when we're talking about the 2008 election, if you look at when social media companies are founded, right, so a lot of people's first exposure to social media was through being part of that platform. And Trump was always trying to deal with he was always trying to find workarounds of existing social media platforms. So it's funny to kind of see him kind of at the end of his political career with Truth Social, and then he had this from the desk of Donald Trump. So again, like having to figure out workarounds from what he perceived of as the sort of negative externality of social media platforms as a vehicle for his, he really preferred television. And he really, one interesting fun fact about Donald Trump is he had an assistant who would print out the top 10 Google News results about Donald Trump every day. And so he really liked those printouts as sort of a sign of his own importance. So it's interesting to kind of see how he sort of moves through that. I think there are ways that sometimes Obama and Trump are using the same words to mean something very different. So they both use the word transparency a lot. But when Obama is talking about transparency, he's like, well, let's go ahead and put all these spreadsheets online so that people can find out all sorts of information about how the government is spending money and what it's spending money on. Now, it's interesting to see that his own communication people tried to put the kibosh on that, because it turns out that putting lots of spreadsheets online is a great way for the media to create negative news stories. Like, essentially, they just sort of handed all the data to their enemies. And so you see this sort of reining in of transparency efforts by Obama's own communication team. Now, when Trump would use the term transparency, and this is where I'm sort of drawing on the work of Timon Bayes and Klaus Pies, who are talking about this relationship between transparency and the arcane, that yelling for transparency is sometimes sort of saying that the truth is so murky that you're never going to actually get the final truth from this call for transparency. Instead, you're going to get a conspiracy theory that's going to have a kind of constantly receding horizon of truth. So I think it's interesting to see how they're often using Silicon Valley rhetoric to mean the same thing, and sometimes they'll use Silicon Valley rhetoric to mean different things. And so I think, but it's really interesting to look at them together. That was not my initial plan when I wrote this book. I was going to just write an Obama book, but turns out I wrote 3 other books in the meantime, and Trump was already president by the time I was sort of finishing that book. But I think that actually they share more than is often thought.
Well, if there are no more questions, then we can only thank you again, Liz, for this wonderful talk and the spirited discussion, and maybe we can continue over refreshments outside.
Thank you all for coming.